The wind carried a faint chill as Gabriel Cross stepped out of the taxi, the dull gleam of the city reflecting in puddles scattered along the cobblestone street. He hadn't planned on being here. He hadn't planned on any of it. The day had been long, an endless string of meetings where faces blurred and voices droned on about profit margins and quarterly reports. He needed a moment to breathe, to escape the suffocating precision of his life. That's why he'd chosen this place. A quiet, tucked-away coffee shop he'd stumbled upon once years ago and nearly forgotten. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside, and warmth greeted him like an old friend. The scent of ground beans and something faintly sweet filled the air. It was small, this cafe. Mismatched chairs, scuffed tables that had seen better days, and a chalkboard menu listing drinks in messy handwriting. None of it fit Gabriel's world, yet something about it made his shoulders ease as he approached the counter. He was about to order, already reaching for his phone, when he heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound, a small sniff. At first it didn't register. City life had taught him to tune out background noise, to focus on the task at hand. But this wasn't the usual chatter of a coffee shop, nor the muffled conversation of patrons on their laptops. It was different. Fragile. Gabriel turned his head slowly, his gaze falling on a small figure by the corner window. A boy, no more than 5 years old. His blonde hair was tousled, and his tiny fingers were wound together tightly, as though holding himself steady. Gabriel might have turned away then, might have gone back to his ordered, meticulously managed world, but then the boy looked up. Their eyes met, and Gabriel felt something shift. The boy's were a deep, clear blue, glassy with tears that hadn't yet fallen. "I can't find my mom," the boy whispered. Gabriel's throat tightened. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they were spoken. Soft. Lost. Like he wasn't sure anyone would hear him at all. He didn't move at first. Gabriel Cross was not the kind of man who got involved. He didn't have time for strangers' problems. His life was controlled, scheduled to the minute, yet his feet carried him forward as if they no longer answered to him. He crouched slowly, making sure not to scare the boy, his tailored coat brushing the old wooden floor. "He there," Gabriel said, keeping his voice low and even. "You okay?" The boy's lip quivered. He blinked hard, as if trying to hold himself together. "I can't find her." Gabriel's eyes flickered around the cafe. There were only a handful of customers. No one seemed concerned, no one watching him. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. Then in that tiny voice again. "Oh, that's a good name," Gabriel said. He glanced back toward the counter. "Leo, was your mom here with you?" "She works here," Leo answered, his voice cracking on the last word. "She said to stay in the back room while she cleaned up. But I got bored." Gabriel gave a small nod, understanding more than he cared to admit about loneliness. "Okay, Leo. Let's figure this out." He rested a reassuring hand on the boy's small shoulder before standing and moving toward the counter. The barista, a young woman with bright pink hair and tired eyes, looked up from the espresso machine as he approached. "This little guy's looking for his mom," Gabriel said. Her face changed instantly. "Oh my God, Leo." She leaned over the counter, calling out toward the back. "It's Leo." Footsteps. Rushed, desperate. Then she appeared, wiping her hands on a towel, her face pale beneath dark hair, pulled into a messy bun. She froze when she saw them, and Gabriel saw the fear melt into overwhelming relief as she rushed forward. "Leo," she breathed, falling to her knees, and gathering the boy into her arms. Her fingers trembled as she ran them through his hair. "You scared me. You can't just run out here like that." "I'm sorry, Mama," Leo whispered, burying his face in her neck. Gabriel took a step back, giving them space, but something gnawed at him. There was something familiar about her. The curve of her jaw. The way her voice softened as she whispered to her son. His mind scrambled to place her. It wasn't until she looked up at him that it hit him like a blow to the chest. Gabriel," she said. Her voice wasn't a question. It wasn't even surprise, it was resignation, like she had imagined this moment 1,000 times and now it had finally arrived. "Ava," Gabriel replied quietly. For a heartbeat, they both stood frozen in the strange gravity of old memories. She looked older, yes. A few faint lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But she was still Eva, the woman who had disappeared from his life 7 years ago without a word. And now, here she was, clutching a child who shared his eyes. The air between them thickened until Leo shifted in her arms, looking between them with innocent curiosity. "Mama," he asked softly. "Who is he?" Eva's lips parted. Gabriel saw the war in her expression. Daniel, lies. She'd lived with them for years already. But when she spoke, it wasn't any of those things. This is Gabriel, she said, her voice trembling. He's your father. The word hung there, raw and sharp, slicing clean through everything that had been left unsaid. Gabriel's breath caught in his chest. He stared at the boy, at Leo, his son. And suddenly, every deal he'd closed, every success he'd ever counted, none of it mattered. The boy tilted his head, studying Gabriel with serious, curious eyes. My Gabriel nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess I am. Eva stood then, keeping a protective hand on Leo's shoulder. We need to talk, she said, her voice steady but strained. Gabriel met her gaze. Yeah, we do. They sat later at a corner table, Eva's fingers curled around a chipped coffee cup. Gabriel's hands clasped in front of him, his mind spinning. Leo had wandered over to the bookshelves and sat quietly, flipping through a picture book. Gabriel's heart ached watching him. You should have told me, Gabriel said quietly. I know, Eva answered. But when I found out I was pregnant, you were gone. You made it clear what mattered to you, your company, your ambition. I didn't think you'd want this. I didn't think you'd want him. You decided that for me, Gabriel murmured, his tone carefully even. Eva closed her eyes. I know. There was no anger in his voice. Just a hollow weight that settled deep in his chest. He had missed everything, his son's first steps, his first words, every birthday, every scrape and bruise and bedtime story. I want to know him, Gabriel said. I want to be his father. Eva's fingers tightened on the cup. He's never had anyone but me. Gabriel's voice didn't waver. Then it's time he had both of us. She stared him a moment longer, and then, slowly, she nodded, and Gabriel let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The following morning, Gabriel stood in front of his bedroom window, the city stretching out before him in pale gray light. His suit jacket lay discarded on the couch, his phone silent on the kitchen counter. He hadn't slept much. Not because of work. His emails and deadlines had been the least of his concerns, but because his mind wouldn't let go of the image of his son. Leo. The way the boy had looked at him, unsure but open, hopeful. Gabriel didn't know what to do with that hope. He wasn't sure he deserved it. He ran a hand down his face and turned away from the window. By 8, he was in his car, driving toward the small apartment building Eva had directed him to. The neighborhood was different from what he was used to. Narrow streets lined with old brick buildings, the occasional corner store, the kids chasing each other down cracked sidewalks. It wasn't dangerous, just worn. Lived in. He parked and climbed the stairs to the second floor, pausing in front of a weathered door with peeling paint. For the first time in years, his hands shook as he raised them to knock. Eva opened the door before he could. She looked tired, her dark hair still damp from the shower. She wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, and Gabriel realized it was the first time he'd seen her without the distance of time or memory softening the edges. She was real now. Present. You're early, she said. Gabriel nodded. I didn't sleep. Her gaze flickered to his, and for a moment he thought he saw something familiar, something like understanding. She stepped aside, letting him in without a word. The apartment was small but clean. Toys were scattered in neat piles, books lined the shelves of a makeshift bookcase. There were pictures on the walls. Drawings mostly, crayon suns and stick figures, and a single framed photo of Leo holding a goldfish in a clear plastic bag. Gabriel felt a strange pang in his chest looking at it. He'd missed everything. And here was this tiny life, full of moments he'd never known existed. Leo appeared a moment later, his face lighting up when he saw Gabriel standing awkwardly by the couch. You came back, Leo said, his voice bright. Gabriel managed a smile. I said I would. Leo's grin widened, and without hesitation, he crossed the room and tugged at Gabriel's hand. Come see my cars. Gabriel followed, sitting down cross-legged on the floor beside him. Leo chattered nonstop as he explained each vehicle, his favorite colors, which ones were the fastest. Gabriel found himself asking questions, leaning in as if it were the most important meeting he'd ever had. And maybe it was. He was learning his son. Learning his world. And for the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing ahead to the next deal or acquisition. Eva moved quietly around the apartment, folding laundry, picking up dishes. But every so often, Gabriel caught her watching them. Watching him. There was something cautious in her gaze, but not as hard as before. She was still measuring him. Still wondering if this would last. Later, when Leo had settled at the table with a coloring book, Gabriel stood and crossed to the kitchen where Eva was pouring juice into a glass. He's. Gabriel paused, searching for the right word. He's incredible. Eva glanced at him. Yeah, he is. Gabriel hesitated. You've done a good job. She pressed her lips together, setting the juice down with a faint clink. I did what I had to. Gabriel exhaled, leaning back against the counter. I'm not here to undo anything. I'm not here to take him from you. She looked at him sharply. That's not what I'm worried about. He waited. Let her find the words. I'm worried about him getting attached to you. Eva said quietly. I'm worried about you being here now and then disappearing again. Gabriel shook his head slowly. I'm not leaving. You say that now. I mean it. But for a long moment, she said nothing. Then she nodded once tightly. Okay. That was all she gave him, but it was more than before. They spent the afternoon in the park. Leo ran ahead, laughing as he chased after pigeons and climbed on the low stone wall that bordered the playground. Gabriel followed more slowly, watching as Eva trailed just a few steps behind Leo, her hand ready to steady him if he stumbled. He's fearless, Gabriel said. Eva smiled faintly. He gets that from you. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. I don't remember being fearless. You were, she said, once. They fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. Gabriel wondered how different things might have been if they'd made different choices back then. If he'd seen what was important before it was too late. Leo tugged at Gabriel's sleeve suddenly, pulling him toward the swings. Push me, he demanded with a grin. Gabriel smiled. You got it. But Eva watched as Gabriel settled behind Leo, giving the swing a gentle push. Leo laughed, his legs kicking at the air as he soared forward. It was the sound of pure joy, and Gabriel realized he wanted more of it, wanted to hear that laugh every day. Afterward, they sat on a bench while Leo dug in the sandbox, building an uneven castle with determination. Gabriel found himself watching Eva as much as Leo. Why didn't you ever tell me where you went? Gabriel asked softly. Eva's hands were folded in her lap, her gaze on Leo. Because I knew if I told you, you'd come after me. And I wasn't ready for that. You thought I wouldn't care. She shook her head. I thought you wouldn't care enough. Gabriel's jaw tightened. You were wrong. I see that now, she admitted. They sat there as the sun began to lower in the sky, Leo's laughter mingling with the sounds of the city. It wasn't perfect. There were still cracks in the foundation of whatever they were building. But Gabriel could feel it. Something was changing. That evening, back at the apartment, Eva made dinner. Simple pasta with tomato sauce. Gabriel found himself setting the table, something he hadn't done since he was a kid. Leo insisted on sitting beside him, his small shoulder pressed close as he picked at his food and told stories about his day. Gabriel listened, more present than he'd been in years. After dinner, Leo yawned and leaned against his mother, his eyelids heavy. Eva glanced at Gabriel, and after a moment's hesitation, she nodded toward the small bedroom. You can put him to bed, she said. Gabriel's chest tightened as he scooped Leo into his arms. The boy's head rested against his shoulder as they walked to the room. Gabriel eased him into the small bed, tucking the blanket around him carefully. Leo blinked up at him sleepily. You'll be here tomorrow, Leo mumbled. Gabriel smiled, brushing a hand over his son's hair. I will. Leo nodded and closed his eyes. Gabriel stood there for a long time after, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, listening to the soft breaths. His son. His family. When he finally stepped back into the living room, Eva was waiting. She handed him a cup of tea without a word and sat beside him on the couch. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. It wasn't a new beginning. Not yet. But it was something. And Gabriel wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm Gabriel had never known before. He found himself returning to the same apartment each evening, learning the cadence of Leo's stories, the shape of his laughter, the weight of his small hand when it curled trustingly around Gabriel's fingers. He became familiar with the squeak of the loose floorboard near the kitchen, the way Eva always hummed under her breath when she washed dishes, the soft click of Leo's bedroom door when she checked on him after he'd fallen asleep. It was strange, how something that had once seemed impossible now felt like it had always been waiting for him. Gabriel had spent years chasing things. Success, control, the perfect outcome. Yet here, in this cramped apartment with mismatched furniture and a crooked bookshelf, he found a different kind of fulfillment. One that didn't require strategy or precision, just showing on. One evening, as Gabriel arrived carrying a small paper bag, Leo ran to the door the moment Eva opened it. His excitement was infectious. "What's that?" Leo demanded, tugging at Gabriel's sleeve. Gabriel crouched down, holding out the bag. "Something for you." Leo's eyes widened as he peered inside. He gasped. "It's a fish." Eva's brows shot up. "A fish?" Gabriel shrugged, glancing at her. "He said I needed one." Leo was already darting to the kitchen table, carefully setting the small bowl down and peering in at the tiny orange fish that now swam lazy circles inside. "What's his name?" Leo asked, already grinning. "I thought you should decide," Gabriel said, watching the boy's face light up as he considered. "Rocket," Leo declared with certainty. "Because he's fast." Eva shook her head, but there was a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "We'll need to get a proper tank for him," she said. We will." Gabriel agreed easily. She gave him a long look, something flickering in her expression that he couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to." There was no argument after that, just Eva watching him with those cautious brown eyes, as if trying to decide if she was ready to believe in this man again. Later, they sat on the floor of the living room, helping Leo color a picture of the fish tank he wanted to build for Rocket. Gabriel found himself sketching along with them, surprised by how easy it was to lose himself in something so simple. Eva laughed softly at his terrible attempt at drawing a castle inside the imaginary tank, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like they were strangers anymore. As the night stretched on, Leo grew tired, his coloring growing sloppier until his hands slowed, and he eventually rested his head on Eva's shoulder. She pressed a gentle kiss to his hair, and Gabriel watched them, something tightening in his chest. Eva caught him staring, and gave him a wary look. "What?" He hesitated, unsure how to say what he was feeling without scaring her off. "I didn't think this would ever happen," he admitted. She looked down at Leo, then back at Gabriel. "Neither did I." They sat there in the quiet for a long time, until Gabriel finally stood, stretching stiffly. "I should go," he said, even though everything in him wanted to stay. Eva rose to her feet too, gently shifting Leo so he could rest against the couch cushions. She followed Gabriel to the door, her arms crossed over her chest. "You're coming tomorrow." He nodded. "If you'll let me." "I'll let you," she said softly. He left the apartment with a strange feeling in his chest, a mixture of hope and something more fragile, something closer to longing. The next day, Gabriel arrived to find Eva waiting on the front steps of the building. She wore a light jacket, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, and Gabriel could see the hesitation in her eyes even before she spoke. "I thought maybe we could go somewhere," she said. Gabriel blinked. The aquarium," she answered. "Leo's been asking about it." A slow smile tugged at Gabriel's mouth. "You're serious?" She shrugged. "He's never been. I thought it might be nice." "Yeah," Gabriel said. "It might be." An hour later, they were walking through the cool, dark corridors of the aquarium, Leo's hand gripping Gabriel's tightly as he dragged him from one exhibit to the next. Eva walked on Leo's other side, her expression softening each time Leo gasped in awe at a passing shark or an enormous sea turtle. They spent nearly an hour at the touch tank, Leo gleefully pressing his fingers to the water's surface to stroke the smooth backs of stingrays. Gabriel watched, leaning on the rail beside Eva. "He's fearless," Gabriel murmured. Eva smiled faintly. "He always has been." Gabriel watched her for a moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. She frowned, glancing at him. "For what?" "For raising him," Gabriel replied. "For taking care of him." She was silent for a long time. Then she exhaled slowly. "I did what I had to." "I know," he said. She didn't argue, didn't pull away, and when Leo ran back over to them, excitedly waving for them to follow him to the next room, she let Gabriel take his hand and lead him there. That night, after they'd dropped Leo off with his grandmother for a sleepover, Eva and Gabriel found themselves sitting at a small table in a quiet diner a few blocks from her apartment. It was the first time they'd been alone together in years. They ate in silence at first, but eventually, Gabriel found himself speaking. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Eva glanced at him. "Do what?" "Be a father," Gabriel said. "Be this person." Eva stirred her coffee slowly. "You don't have to have all the answers," she said. "Just be here." He let that sit for a moment, then he nodded. "I want to be here," he said. She gave him a long look. "Then be here," she said simply. They sat for a while longer, talking quietly about Leo, about school, about the things Gabriel had missed. It wasn't easy, it wasn't seamless. But it was honest. Later, walking her back to the apartment, Gabriel paused at the door. "Thank you," he said again. Eva shook her head. "Stop thanking me." He smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I can." She opened the door but didn't go inside right away. She turned to him, her expression softer now, less guarded. "Good night, Gabriel," she said. "Good night, Eva," he replied. And as he walked back to his car, Gabriel realized something. He wasn't just building a relationship with Leo. He was rebuilding something with Eva too. Something broken and battered, but still there beneath the damage. He didn't know where it would lead. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to find out. The days melted into one another with a rhythm Gabriel had never imagined he'd crave. He woke earlier now, even before his alarm, eager for the sun to rise so he could make his way across the city to that small apartment where Leo and Eva lived. His life, which once revolved around meetings and mergers and flights scheduled to the minute, had softened. It had changed. He noticed the details now. The smell of toast in Eva's kitchen when he arrived in the morning, the scuffed sneakers Leo insisted on wearing everywhere, because he was convinced they made him run faster. The way Eva absently brushed a hand over Leo's hair as she passed him on her way to work, never realizing the gesture was as natural as breathing. Gabriel found himself wanting to be a part of that world more than anything, and it terrified him. One Friday afternoon, he arrived earlier than usual. Eva had called that morning with a rushed apology about having to work a double shift at the cafe, and before she could finish the sentence, Gabriel had offered to pick Leo up from school. He didn't hesitate anymore. He wanted to be there. Now, standing outside the small brick building with a group of other parents and guardians, Gabriel realized he felt out of place. He adjusted his jacket, realizing he was the only one in a suit. He ran a hand through his hair as children began spilling through the doors, their laughter filling the air. And then he saw him. Leo, backpack askew on his shoulders, racing down the steps with his usual reckless speed. He scanned the crowd, his face lighting up the second he spotted Gabriel. "You came," Leo shouted, weaving through the other kids until he collided with Gabriel in a hug that nearly knocked him off balance. Gabriel laughed, steadying himself. "I said I would, didn't I?" Leo's arms tightened for a moment, then he stepped back, already launching into a story about what had happened that day in class. Gabriel let him talk, listening as they walked together back toward the apartment. They stopped for ice cream on the way home. Vanilla with rainbow sprinkles, of course. And Gabriel found himself sitting on a bench in the park as Leo swung his legs and ate his cone with all the focus of a world-class scientist. Gabriel watched him for a while before speaking. "Do you like school?" Leo shrugged. "It's okay." Gabriel smiled faintly. "Just okay." Leo licked his ice cream thoughtfully. "Yeah. But I like art the best. We get to draw whatever we want." Gabriel nodded. "Maybe you can show me sometime." Leo brightened. "I can do that. I drew a rocket ship last week." Gabriel chuckled. "Of course you did." By the time they got home, the sun was beginning to set. Gabriel made dinner. Simple spaghetti, nothing fancy, and Leo helped by grating cheese and setting the table. Eva's apartment, which had always seemed too small to Gabriel at first, now felt warm, familiar. They ate together at the kitchen table, and after Leo had taken a bath and settled on the couch with his favorite blanket, Gabriel read to him. He stumbled over the voices a little, but Leo didn't seem to mind. If anything, it made him laugh harder, and Gabriel realized how much he'd missed the sound. It was almost 9 when Eva finally walked through the door, her shoulders tense and exhaustion on her face. She froze when she saw them. Leo curled under a blanket, Gabriel sitting beside him with a book in hand. For a moment, she looked like she didn't know whether to walk further inside or back out again. Gabriel stood slowly, closing the book. "He's out cold," he said quietly. Eva crossed to the couch, brushing a hand over Leo's damp hair. "He waits up for me," she murmured. Gabriel's voice softened. "He tried. Didn't make it," but Eva gave a faint smile. "You made dinner," he nodded. "You kept it simple." She glanced up at him. "Thank you." Gabriel shook his head. "You don't have to thank me." She straightened, stretching her back with a wince. "I think I do." Gabriel hesitated. "You're doing too much, Eva." "I don't have a choice, Ka." "You do," he said quietly. She turned to him, her expression wary. "What are you saying?" Gabriel took a breath. He'd thought about this for days, unsure if it was too soon, too much. But watching her stand there, tired but still strong, he realized it wasn't about him. It was about giving her and Leo more than survival. I want to help, Gabriel said. More than just picking him up from school. More than dinner and bedtime stories. Eva crossed her arms, defensive out of habit. What does that mean? It means you don't have to do this alone anymore, Gabriel said. Let me help. She stared at him for a long time, weighing his words like they were an offer she couldn't afford to take. This isn't temporary, she said finally. Gabriel nodded. I'm not temporary. Her shoulders sagged slightly. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But she didn't push him away either. She moved past him into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. You'll need to talk to him, she said over her shoulder. He doesn't understand why things are changing. Gabriel followed her, leaning against the counter. I'm learning. She gave him a long look. So am I. That night, Gabriel stayed until late, helping her clean up, listening as she talked quietly about her worries, school fees, rent, the simple weight of keeping everything together. Gabriel didn't offer solutions, didn't throw money at her, he just listened, and when she finally looked at him, something in her gaze had shifted. You should go, Eva said softly, glancing at the clock. Gabriel nodded. I'll be back tomorrow. She walked him to the door, lingering there for a moment. He thought she might say something else, but instead she reached for his hand briefly, her fingers warm against his. Good night, Gabriel, she murmured. Good night, Eva. And when he walked away, he realized her touch lingered longer than he expected. The next few weeks passed like that. Small moments that built something they hadn't had before. Trust. Quiet dinners turned into shared laughter. Leo insisted Gabriel be at his school play, and afterward, he rushed into Gabriel's arms without a second thought. Eva smiled more easily, though her guard never fully dropped. Gabriel didn't expect it to. He knew trust took time. But one Saturday morning, everything changed again. Gabriel had taken Leo to the park, giving Eva a rare moment to herself. They played soccer in the grass, Leo's laughter filling the air as he darted around Gabriel's legs with surprising speed. Gabriel ran after him, pretending to be slower than he was, letting the boy win. And then, as they sat together on a bench, Leo sipping from his water bottle, he asked the question Gabriel had been waiting for. Can I call you Dad? Gabriel froze, his breath catching. He glanced at Leo, who watched him seriously waiting for an answer. You can call me whatever you want, Gabriel said carefully. Leo nodded, as if weighing it, then smiled. Dad, he said softly. I like that. Gabriel's throat tightened. He reached out, brushing a hand over Leo's hair. I like that too. When they returned to the apartment later that day, Eva opened the door and froze at the sight of them. Gabriel didn't say anything, but Leo grinned and ran past her into the living room. Dad said I can pick the movie. Leo called over his shoulder. Eva turned slowly to Gabriel, her eyes wide. She didn't speak right away. He asked. Gabriel said quietly. I didn't push him. She nodded once, the emotion in her expression unspoken but understood. She stepped back, letting him inside, and Gabriel realized that something had changed between them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And Gabriel knew he would never leave again. The sky outside was streaked with the deep blues and violets of dusk. By the time Gabriel stepped back, inside the apartment, he had spent the day wrapping up business deals and navigating conference calls that usually drained him. But now he felt something close to relief. Not from finishing work, but from returning here, where the hours passed differently. Where his time wasn't measured in contracts or bottom lines but in smiles and questions and stories about dinosaurs. Leo was already waiting for him at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he bounced on his toes. When he saw Gabriel pull up, his grin lit up his whole face, and he ran to the door before Gabriel had even made it up the steps. Eva opened it before he could knock. She gave him a quiet smile, small but easier than it had been days ago, and she stepped aside without hesitation. He's been waiting for you, she said softly. I can tell, Gabriel replied, stepping inside. His coat was barely hung up before Leo grabbed his hand, tugging him toward the small kitchen table where colored pencils were scattered like confetti and a half-finished drawing sat in front of an empty chair. We're making a map, Leo explained, scrambling back into his seat and pointing to the paper. It's for the treasure. Gabriel sat down across from him, glancing at Eva. She stood nearby, arms crossed lightly over her chest, watching them. There was no wariness in her expression now, at least, not the kind that had been there in those first days. It was something gentler, careful yes, but open in a way it hadn't been before. A treasure map, huh? Gabriel said, focusing on Leo again. Where's the treasure hidden? Leo grinned. You have to figure it out. But I'll give you clues. Gabriel leaned in, playing along, letting Leo explain the rules of his game, as if it were a matter of great importance. Eva poured tea for herself and Gabriel without a word and set his mug down beside him. He noticed the faint tremor in her hand again, but said nothing, waiting for her to speak. When she was ready, they spent the next hour finishing the map. Leo drawing crooked trees and uneven mountains, labeling places with names that made Gabriel smile. Rockfish Lake, for example, and the Cave of Superheroes. Where's the X? Gabriel asked. Leo looked at him, his expression serious. You have to find it. I'm not telling. Eva laughed softly from the kitchen. He gets that from me. Gabriel glanced at her. I'm starting to believe that. By the time Leo's eyelids began to droop and his head tilted forward over his drawings, Eva stood, smoothing her hands down the front of her jeans. Bedtime, she said quietly. Leo groaned but didn't argue as she helped him to his feet. Gabriel stood as well, watching as Leo paused and turned back toward him. Will you be here tomorrow? Leo asked, his voice sleepy but hopeful. Gabriel crouched down, steadying his gaze on the boy's face. I'll be here. Leo nodded like that was all he needed, and then he let his mother guide him to his room. Gabriel sat back down at the table, staring at the paper map and tracing the messy lines with his fingers. When Eva returned a few minutes later, she moved more quietly. She sat across from him again, her fingers curled around her tea. I didn't think this would get easier, she said after a moment. Gabriel looked up at her. Is it? She shrugged. Some days. She paused, then added, You're good with him. Gabriel let out a quiet breath. I'm trying. He knows, she said. And he's never had that before. Gabriel's throat tightened. You did everything on your own. I did what I had to do. Eva said again, but there wasn't as much weight in the words as there had been before. And now you're here. I am, Gabriel said softly. And I'm not leaving. They sat in silence again, the kind that no longer felt like a wall between them. It was something quieter now, something easier. Gabriel glanced toward Leo's bedroom door. You've done a good job with him, he said again. You made a home. Eva's eyes dropped to the table. It hasn't always felt like one. Gabriel hesitated. It could be. She looked up slowly. What do you mean? He met her gaze steadily. I have a place. There's room for both of you. She didn't speak right away. She sat very still, searching his face, looking for something solid to hold onto in his words. I can't just uproot him, she said quietly. He's never lived anywhere else, and I'm not sure I can ask him to leave behind what's familiar just because we. Gabriel nodded. I'm not asking for anything right now, except for more time, wherever it is. She sighed, rubbing her temple as if she could wipe away years of exhaustion. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I, Gabriel admitted, but I want to try. She studied him for a long time. Then slowly, she nodded. A week later, Gabriel found himself standing in front of a row of bicycles at a small local shop. Leo's hand was tight around his as they walked up and down the line of bikes, his eyes wide with excitement. That one, Leo said, pointing to a bright green bike with training wheels and shiny handles. Gabriel crouched down beside him. You sure? Leo nodded, practically vibrating. Yeah. Eva stood nearby, her arms crossed but not with skepticism, more like she was holding herself together. Gabriel looked at her, silently asking the question. She gave a small nod. They left the shop with the bike strapped to the back of Gabriel's car, Leo practically bouncing in the back seat. He talked the entire way back to the apartment about how fast he would ride and how he wanted to put stickers all over the frame. That afternoon, they took him to the park, Gabriel walking beside him as Leo climbed on and gripped the handlebars. The first few tries were awkward, the bike wobbling dangerously, but Gabriel was there each time, steadying the seat, keeping Leo from tipping over. You're doing great, Gabriel told him. I'm gonna go fast, Leo shouted, his face red with excitement. Eva laughed from the sidelines. Not too fast. They spent hours there, the sun dipping lower and the sky burning gold and pink. By the time they walked back to the apartment, Leo was half asleep in Gabriel's arms, his cheek resting on Gabriel's shoulder. Eva unlocked the door and held it open for them. Gabriel stepped inside, setting Leo down gently on the couch. The boy stirred only a little, then curled into the cushions, breathing slow and even. Eva closed the door softly and turned toward Gabriel. Her expression was unreadable at first, but then she shook her head with something like wonder. "You're good with him," she said again. Gabriel smiled faintly. "He makes it easy." They stood there for a moment, the quiet settling between them again. Then Eva stepped forward and pressed her lips to his cheek. Just a soft, fleeting touch. But it left him standing there, completely still, as she moved past him toward the kitchen. That night, Gabriel didn't leave right away. He stayed as Leo slept, drinking tea with Eva and talking about small things. About how Leo hated peas, about how he was scared of thunder, about how he loved bedtime stories about dragons. And somewhere between one story and the next, Gabriel realized something. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't some borrowed moment. This was the beginning of something he hadn't dared to hope for in years. And he wasn't going to lose it. The rain had softened to a mist by the time Gabriel found himself standing outside Eva's apartment again. He wasn't sure how long he'd been staring at the door, his hand hovering just above the wood, listening to the faint hum of life beyond it. He had imagined this day so many times, but nothing about it felt rehearsed. It felt real, immediate. When Eva opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She simply stepped aside, letting him in, as if she'd known he would come. Leo was sitting on the floor, his blocks scattered around him, building something Gabriel couldn't quite name but watched anyway. Eva's voice was quiet when she spoke. "He's been waiting for you." Gabriel nodded and crouched down beside Leo. "What are you making?" Leo smiled without looking up. "A house. One where everyone stays." Gabriel's throat tightened. He reached out, adding another block to Leo's tower, steadying it when it wobbled. "Sounds like a good place." They spent the afternoon together, cooking dinner in Eva's small kitchen, laughing when Leo insisted on being the one to stir the sauce. It was messy and chaotic, but Gabriel found he didn't mind. Later, when the dishes were done and Leo was asleep, Gabriel and Eva sat together on the couch, the soft ticking of the clock filling the quiet. "I've been thinking," Gabriel said. Eva's gaze slid to his. "About this, him, this." He paused. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." She studied him, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "I'm still learning how to trust that." "I'll give you as much time as you need," Gabriel said. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded slowly. "And if we fall apart again?" Gabriel shook his head. "We'll build something stronger." Eva set her mug down, her hand brushing his. It was small, but it was everything. "I want that," she whispered. And he believed her. Weeks passed. Leo grew more comfortable with Gabriel at his side, their bond deepening in ways that made Gabriel's chest ache with something he hadn't felt in years. Love. Pure and simple. The kind that asked for nothing but gave everything in return. One evening, Leo climbed onto Gabriel's lap with a book in his hand and a sleepy smile on his face. "Will you read to me?" Gabriel wrapped his arms around him, the weight of the boy settling against his chest. "Every night," he promised. As he read, Eva sat across from them, her legs tucked under her, watching with a soft expression Gabriel had come to know. Trust. Hope, maybe even love. And in that quiet room, with Leo's breathing slowing against him and Eva's fingers brushing his, Gabriel finally understood. Family wasn't something you earned. It was something you chose, and he chose them, every day, forever.